Good evening and welcome to the first of this series of 3 webinars devoted to the topic of promotion of intercultural dialogue through media, visual and performing arts, which has been organized by Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore within the framework of the research program Migrations, Mediations. I will spend just a few words to introduce this project and this series of web seminars. So, first of all, Migrations Mediations is a research project conducted at the Department of Communication and Performing Arts of the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan since 2017, and it is currently in its final phase. This project, which has been founded as a university interest project, gave birth to various publications, seminars, a national conference held in January 2019, and webinars in May, June 2021, this one. I refer to our website, which is www.migrations-mediations.com, which contains a series of informations on the project, but also, as I will say, two massive databases about a series of good practices in the territory of Milan about the use of arts media in the intercultural dialogue. Our project had a twofold nature. First, it was a traditional research project, and as such, it mapped more than 400 realities in the territory of Milan, of different kind of institutions working on the territory, particularly in the Milan suburbs, to promote the intercultural dialogue through the arts, through the culture, and by using different kind of media. We presently have two, as I say, the two massive databases in our website. The first contains the official documents by policymakers and a series of video interviews, video dialogue with the policymakers, and the second database review a series of grassroots experience developed in our area. The second aspect of the project, Migrations Mediation, has a more operational character, and we aim to promote meetings between institutions, producers, artists, organizers, in order to exchange projects, exchange ideas, and to spread good practices in order to encourage their replicability. So, in the wake of this program, we open today the first of the 3 webinars, which are intended to focus the attention of scholars, artists, cultural providers, public and private funders, but also policymakers, to focus their attention on both at a local and at a global or international level, to the actual or potential role of media, arts, culture in the management of policies devoted to migration phenomena. Indeed, in our perception, on the one hand, the EU member states and the European Union have recently demonstrated a certain sensitivity toward exploring the ways in which media, arts, performative practices are able to both facilitate intercultural dialogue among migrant and host communities, and at the same time to promote cultural diversity at the level of different ethnical, cultural, religious, linguistic backgrounds and heritage within the different European communities and the different European societies. On the other hand, we think that despite this high potential for opening new perspectives, these guidelines seems the guidelines the most important guidelines within this field seem mostly unexplored, little discussed, especially within the academic communities, which is mainly focused on the themes of representation of migrant people, and it can hardly be disregarded that a practical implementation of these guidelines faces a series of difficulties, both at the local and at a global level, so that, so to speak, a serious reflection and a multi-perspective reflection on the main guidelines governing the dialogue based on arts and media between local communities and migrants today appears an absolute priority, and it is for this reason that we decided to organize this series of webinars. Tonight's speakers, the speakers of this first appointment, are Angelique PETRITS, who works at European Commission, Unit C2, Legal Pathways and Integration, and Giuseppe Fidotta, who presently works at Concordia University in Montreal. So I first introduce Angelique PETRITS. She obtained a PhD in sociolinguistics, and she has a long-standing experience within the European Commission in the fields of language, education, and culture. Between 2004 and 2009, she has been EMT project manager. We're working to set up and coordinate the European Masters in Translation project, and she is presently language officer at European Commission. Angelique is going to speak today about the issue. The title is From Integration to Inclusion: Why Culture Matters and How to Build a Positive Narrative. I warmly thanks Angelique for her presence and her participation to our webinar. And Angelique, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruggero. Thank you for the introduction. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Milan with you in your fantastic university. I've heard so much about this university and in a cluster that I hope one day that I'll be able to to see it. And thank you for the introduction. Maybe I have to say that currently I'm working in migration. As you heard, my background is in linguistics. And so I worked in culture and languages in London for many years. But since 2017, I decided, when going back to Brussels, I decided to change completely field and to start working in migration and actually integration of migrants, which is actually, I found that quite fascinating subject. So to start this presentation, I'll share with you some thoughts, some conclusions that several reports that we commissioned have, and also the political background. So how we propose solutions and how we go about them, of course, liaising integration and inclusion to building a positive narrative in Europe. So we start, second slide. We start with a background. So if we go back to 2015, more than 1.3 million asylum applications were registered within the EU. And this is twice as much as the level recorded the year before, in 2014. It's when the big influx of migration arrived in Europe, mainly in Italy and Greece, but also in other countries. And this happened, of course, alongside financial crisis, which created a very challenging context for many European countries. So cultural diversity can have both positive and negative impacts on European societies. On one hand, history has shown that times of financial crisis can lead to increased xenophobia and extremism. But on the other hand, cultural diversity can be a tool for addressing the roots of conflict and for promoting social cohesion. So in November 2015, this first crisis year, if we can call it like that, migration crisis year, the culture ministers of the EU got together and agreed that beyond providing humanitarian support to meet migrants and refugees' immediate needs, of course, all these people arriving, attention had to be paid to their social and cultural integration. And this is for the first time that the Council in 2015 says this. I mean, it is in the minutes of the Council. So herein lies an important role for cultural organizations in promoting intercultural dialogue, and I quote now the Council, by becoming spaces for deepening an understanding of different cultures and providing room for participative and creative encounters, cultural institutions play a pivotal role in connecting people and in building a more cohesive and open society. So cultural ministers also agreed that culture and the arts have a role to play in the process of integrating refugees who will be granted asylum status. So they agreed, for this reason, to create a new working group made of member state experts in the context of the migration and refugee crisis, in order to explore how culture and the arts can bring individuals and peoples together and increase participation in cultural and societal life. So we know very well from research that integration is a two-way process. So it means that as much as about the way in which destination countries receive migrants, it is as much as what migrants do to adapt in their new environment. So one factor that might limit integration is discrimination and prejudice, which is one key area of overlap between discussions on culture and discussions on migration. So here lies a strong rationale for exploring the ways in which art and culture can help in the integration of refugees and migrants in Europe. And however, the crossovers are not limited to this. For instance, language plays a key role in integration. And the use of arts and culture can help to both promote non-verbal communication between different groups, promoting intercultural dialogue, as well as support migrants in language acquisition. So another example is that in acknowledging the potential economic impact of creative industries to countries of destination, we can also start thinking about the opportunities that migration brings and shifts the discourse towards a discussion of positive solutions to global challenges. So migrants can be participants or actors in cultural transformation. So art and culture of immigrants and refugees can enable the cultivation of heritage, traditions, customs, and culture of the origin country. But maintaining a cultural identity of the country of origin can have very positive effects on integration if it is combined with identification with the destination country. So other migrants and refugees' cultural and artistic productions develop ways of expressing the challenges of the immigrant community in the destination country and to raise the voice against discrimination, therefore having a transformative role by contributing to community cohesion, structural integration, and social change. So artistic expression can be an important tool in therapeutic settings, since it promotes self-esteem, facilitates the expression of emotions, as well as the processing of traumatic experiences. Creative and artistic tools in therapies offer the means for refugees to explore, express, and reconstruct their emotions and experiences, often related to conflict, violence, and exile. And both quantitative and qualitative studies indicate that art therapy can improve physical, mental, and emotional well-being of immigrants and refugees and promote their social inclusion. So while art and culture, by, for, and with migrants and refugees, can promote well-being and dismantle structural barriers to integration, at the same time, they can have exclusionary potential themselves. In spite of the interest of ethnic groups to attend arts and performance events, structural barriers such as the lack of financial means and languages difficulties, along with a lack of identification with some art forms and contents, can hinder the consumption of arts and culture by migrants or refugees. So exclusive cultural and institutional structures can also hinder migrants and refugees to get actively involved in the arts and culture scene, and thus limit its inclusive potential. A lack of access to resources from public organizations might impede refugees and migrants to self-organize and realize artistic and creative initiatives. Moreover, the closed character of the formal Western art world, as we know it, and the potential lack of social and cultural capital of refugees and migrants further decreases their chances to enter the arts and culture scene, leaving them at the margins of cultural life. So the expert group, which was set up by these ministers of culture, did a concept note and identified 96 initiatives from across Europe for a mapping exercise, which it started doing. So it published a report, and that was in 2016. And in this report, as I said, there was this mapping exercise with this 96 initiatives. We can have next slide, please. Next slide. Can see the initiative. No, sorry. Excuse me. No, before. It's here. Yes, thank you. Sorry, it's so small on. So the initiatives, these 96 initiatives, just over 1/3 were classified as art and culture in general, diverse, and this means that they used at least 2 different forms of art in the implementation. For instance, the organization of festivals, which designed to celebrate multicultural communities and to reach out to a broader audience. So a common element between these projects was first to engage different groups in the organization of events, and second, the use of food as celebration of culture, and that I find quite interesting. So I think, so we can go to the next slide, please, to see the conclusions. Yes. So in general, a positive relationship exists between cultural activities and different dimensions of integration. Many of the identified initiatives largely target cultural integration through the promotion of intercultural dialogue and the celebration of multiculturalism as a general aim to shift perspectives and perception on migration. Third, projects in the area of art and culture can help to emotionally engage a broad audience in the discussion of sometimes contentious issues. They can contribute to emotional and personal development for participants. Also, involvement of participants in project design. This is a key in order to build trust and ownership of projects, which can then be key in addressing the challenge of ongoing participation required. So if you feel part of a project, you will participate. So many of the initiatives that target young people also have a component that contributes to language acquisition, which is a key determinant of integration, because language is about communication. So if you cannot communicate, how can you integrate? So furthermore, the use of arts and culture in a therapeutic setting can have positive outcomes on the well-being of migrants, which can be a determinant of successful integration as well. And last but not least, a diverse cultural scene can also have positive economic spillover effects, which can both increase economic opportunities for migrants to integrate, as well as contribute in general to city development through, for example, can be cultural tourism. Okay, next, please. Yes. So after this report, we are in 2016. 2015 is the migration flags. The ministers of culture decide to set up this group. The group produced a report 2016, and at the same time, the Commission produced its first action plan on integration of migrants and refugees. And 4 years later, 2020, we have a new action plan on integration and inclusion, which was adopted last November. And the difference, one main difference between the two is that the new action plan includes also citizens, EU citizens with a migrant background, not only migrants themselves, which means the people who have arrived in the country, but also people who may have, who are born in the country and may have even the nationality of the country, but have one parent who is a migrant, who was a migrant. So this has a broader scope. So next slide, please. So the action plan, our new action plan on integration, has many areas of horizontal action, and there are several vertical actions, which I will not present today because it's not part of the subject, but they are quite interesting as well. So two of these, out of these 5 many areas of action, consider it's about mainstreaming gender and anti-discrimination priorities. And it's also about maximizing the added value through multi-stakeholder partnerships, which means, I'll explain more in detail later, but it means we have all to come all together in order to succeed in integration. It's not one partner, one organization, one state that can do that by its own. So next slide, please. So what we did in this new action plan, we built on our, the strong aspects and the weaknesses of the previous action plan, which were identified. So one of the areas of improvement was the role of the host society in the integration process. So we understood that we need to focus more on the host society. So next slide, please. So about the strong partnerships, because the host society is one of the partners, but integration may be managed centrally by the states. The integration strategy are driven by states, but integration happens locally. And to happen locally, we need to include the local and regional authorities, which are very important, municipalities are extremely important, civil society organization, social and economic partners, but of course also the host communities. We have all together, we have to build partnerships with all these actors in order to succeed. So next slide, please. So about fostering now participation and encounters in the host society, I mean, what we want, what we plan to do, what we have to do in order to foster this participation. So whether it is at school, the office, a sport club, or in the neighborhood, providing places and opportunities for migrants and local communities to meet and interact is a very strong means for inclusion and, of course, more cohesive societies. And the promotion of intercultural dialogue, including also interreligious dialogue between different faith communities, is very essential. So supporting migrants' participation interactions with the host society also requires providing opportunities for the local communities to learn more about people arriving in their communities and their background. So community sponsorship schemes not only help member states to increase the number of places for people in need of protection, can be through resettlement, humanitarian admission, and other complementary pathways, but also to successfully integrate them into welcoming host communities that are aware of and prepared for their arrival. Involve migrants and migrant organizations in decision-making process. This is also a very important element. And in the Commission, we set up also last November an expert group of migrants for the first time. And this expert group is consulted for the different policies that we implement, we design and implement that affect them directly. And we already consulted them, I think, 2 or 3 times, and it has been really very powerful. And there are people who have a lot to say about migration policy and integration policy. So other things we plan to do, for instance, implement an integration award for schools, for local communities, artistic and cultural organizations, and sports and youth clubs. Football festivals can be very powerful. So we have also a cooperation with UEFA. We don't know when it will happen because of the the COVID crisis, but we hope to implement it soon. And also we have projects to raise awareness on facts and figures about the main trends of immigration for journalists, because we need to take the journalists on board, because it's them who will help build this positive narrative on integration, on migration and integration. So next slide, please. Yes, this is about the migrant expert group, which I mentioned, and it has 24 experts coming from different backgrounds, from different EU member states, but they come, of course, from around the world. And they are migrants themselves, and they are quite involved in advocacy on migrants. They are members of migrant organizations, migrant councils, academia, business and trade unions. And it was a very successful operation, because we received almost 400 applications for, we wanted at the beginning to have 20, a group of 20, we had 24 because we had so good applications, and we wanted to include also more. And also in our call for proposals in the Asylum, Migration, Integration Fund in 2019, we had a topic about promoting the participation of migrants in the design and implementation of integration policies. So you see, Ruggero, you said at the beginning that not much is done by the institutions, but since 2015-16, I think a lot has been done proportionally about this. So the next slide, please. So the urban agenda for the EU partnership on the inclusion of migrants and refugees brings together cities, national authorities, and the European Commission. It's hosted by the City of Amsterdam and DG Home, to develop recommendations and actions in order to improve the inclusion of migrants. It was set up in 2016 and now has been extended up to 2021. So while European societies are becoming more diverse, this is not always reflected in what is on offer and celebrated in key cultural institutions or the media. So beyond normalizing diversity, the arts, such as visual art, music, and dance, can also transcend typical language barriers and facilitate interaction and communication between groups who may not otherwise come into contact with each other. And that can include newcomers, for instance, in a society with longer standing community members. So under the right conditions, this content could reduce conflict, counter stereotypes, and boost empathy. So the Pattern on Inclusion of Migrants and Refugees proposed as part of its work plan 21-22 an action on advancing the role of art and culture on promoting inclusion and fighting racism. And in a first step, this action aims to produce a scoping paper which will look at approaches to promote social inclusion and cohesion in diverse societies through art and culture. And in a second step, the partnership will draw on the scoping paper to identify an action to be pursued until the end of the current partnership. So next slide, please. Yes. So the role now of arts and culture in promoting inclusion and fighting racism. This strand of work, which will be presented next year, would explore the following themes, which have been identified as important. There are 5 themes. So what do we know about what works? So despite the potential benefits of arts and culture events for bringing together diverse communities, we spoke about it, very little is known about what kinds of activities are most effective. So instead, events are often conceptualized and executed based on intuition or precedent, rather than a robust evidence, an evidence base of what works. Second, the representation in museums and cultural institutions. So museums in Europe are grappling with how to contextualize the objects on display. Contextualize in a way that acknowledges both the potentially problematic histories of the collector, such as due to their active role in colonialism or slavery, and the perspectives of ethnic minority communities and their relationship to certain objects. Third, supporting minority artists. So the personal stories and perspectives of people with minority ethnic backgrounds are underrepresented within the arts. And this limits their exposure and normalization among the broader society. So, but people from minority ethnic backgrounds can face greater restrictions to their artistic pursuits, particularly where they do not have social networks within the established art work. They lack these networks, or an economic cushion that can allow them to focus on creating. Fourth, managing cultural change. So rather than being a static set of practices, cultural traditions are under constant negotiations in terms of who celebrates them and how. So some attempts to reform cultural events with racist overtones, such as the Zwarte Piet and other blackface characters in the Netherlands and Belgium and the UK, or to make them more inclusive or diverse, such as in Orléans, Jeanne d'Arc, for instance, for Jeanne d'Arc was casted a mixed race teenager. So these actions have received pushbacks from community members and inflamed tensions between groups. So we need to take this into account. And fifth, giving ethnic minority residents a seat at the table. So much of the decision-making around whether to remove or erect statues, to create or commission public art installations, and to organize cultural events happens at the political level. But people with minority backgrounds tend to be underrepresented in both national and local levels in politics. So next slide, please. So the outcomes, what are the expected outcomes? So what the scoping paper will do? So generate greater awareness of the field. Point to areas in which multi-level approaches and EU-level interventions can bring the greatest added value. Again, how we can put our strength together. Building on the scoping exercise, longer-term actions may involve, for example, the development of recommendations or guidelines, planning and conference, or have a more regular form of exchange, or even invest in further research. So it could be interesting maybe to present to this audience, if you're interested, once we have this report and we have the results, maybe it would be interested in another event, maybe in Milan, to present it. So next, please. So this is a project, it's called HopeBased Communication. It's not our project. It's not an EU project, but I find that quite inspiring. So I would like to mention it before I finish. So the hope-based communication, I mean, if we think of the media representation and visibility of vulnerable groups like migrants and refugees remains very marginal in the mainstream media across Europe. And the impressions media give about these vulnerable groups are sometimes negative, stigmatizing, and even pure disinformation. So this hope-based communication is meant to be a strategy for change. And the aim of the method is to set your own agenda as human rights activists by creating new solution-focused narratives of your own. So it proposes 5 simple shifts, which is about moving from negative to positive. So moving from fear to hope. So some politicians, for instance, and media outlets rely on negative narratives, using fear to trigger emotions like suspicion and disgust, and a sense of crisis and chaos. So hope is the idea that things can change for the better, is a key to connecting people with positive emotions, let's say like joy, humor, compassion, empathy, and so on and so forth. So say what you are for instead of what you are against. Again, move to the positive. Provide solutions, not just problems, not enumerate problems, but come up with creative solutions. Focus on the opportunity, not the threat, the opportunity that migrants can bring to our societies, not present them as a threat to our culture. And show everyday human heroes, not powerless victims. We saw so many pictures, of poor migrants arriving into our coasts in Italy, in Greece, and very few pictures of migrants which, for instance, contribute to the COVID-19 pandemic by being essential workers, if you compare. So next, please. So this is a project. This is an EU project. It's about shifting narratives, about positive narratives about migrants. It can be, yes, it is an example of hope-based communication. I think it's a good illustration of hope-based communication. And I invite you, I mean, this is just a trailer. I invite you to go and, on the website and look at the project and watch all the trailers, because we have in several member states, I think it's 7 member states, we have different trailers with migrants and host communities, and it's very interesting. So it highlights the positive social and economic contributions that migrants made in our communities in Europe. And we worked with service media, community media, and civil society organizations, mainly to challenge the stereotypes and expose the commonly held myths in order to place migrant voices at the heart of discussions on migration. And also to foster tolerance and acceptance for migrants and refugees in EU states by promoting direct participation in media production and intercultural dynamics. So maybe we can watch the trailer now. We can watch the trailer, take some time. Yeah.
هيا على الفلاح.
Why do you drink orange juice? This is a German pop.
Esta pared, justamente, es una pared muy fina.
¿Tú me enseñas inglés?
The first thing. Yeah. Okay.
Neki ste neuro, non lo so come si chiama.
Biti su naši ljudi, bitan je naš kvart, mi imamo to stotine problema u našem kvartu.
A onda svira.
Možeš jedinička v češki jezik?
Bravo. Het lijkt me steeds meer komen.
Znači, Putin je to najljepše rekao, ne? Došli si u Rusiju, ponaši se ko Rusi.
Ja, da ne može pustiti.
Meine Zukunft? Ich habe keine Ahnung.
Okay, so next slide, please. So I hope you found this trailer inspiring. I put together in this slide, I put together different projects with Creative Europe about integration of migrants and art and culture. So you will see the slide. Yes, here it is. And so you can have a look at the project. And at the last slide, there are some links about the action plan and other policy papers. And there is a project which is also quite interesting, EU funded. It's the CHAC, which is with the municipality of Milan, which is about also shifting narratives, and it involves journalists and school of journalists, where they teach journalists how to create a positive narrative about migrants, which I found quite interesting. Probably you know it's in Milan, but it's a very successful project. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Angelique. Thank you so much. It has been, in my view, very interesting to hear, so to say, a first-hand indications about the European Commission policy. Well, yeah, I have to confess that when I said that nothing or almost nothing has been made, it was a rhetorical trick in order to provoke your reaction. And but I have to thank you also for mentioning New Neighbors, which is an initiative we monitored, and we invited them in our international conference. We are presently shifting in order to, with the hope to have it in person and not by a web form. So thank you so much for your interesting and precious speech. And now the next speaker is Giuseppe Fidotta. Giuseppe is presently a PhD student in film and moving image studies at the Mel Hopnine School of Cinema and a part-time PhD lecturer at Concordia University in Montreal. He previously obtained a PhD from the University of Udine, and well, he published many essays on media geography, the planetary imagination of the essay movie, on Italian colonial cinema and many other topics. He co-edited a seminal anthology on media archaeology in Italian, and he edited a special issue of Nexus, European Journal of Media Studies, on mapping and the media. And he is one of the organizer of a series of extremely interesting seminars organized by Next on media and migrations. So thank you, Giuseppe, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruggero, for inviting me today, and thank you, Martina, Nicolas, and the other members of the organizing team for your support. Nicolas, you can start the presentation. So, it's a pleasure for me to be contributing to this series of webinars on media migration and intercultural dialogue with a paper that's essentially a reflection on these topics from the standpoint of film studies. Perhaps the discipline within media studies that has contributed the least to our understanding of migration and intercultural dialogue. In this talk, I attend to this failure of imagination from the side of the discipline as a dual problem of perspective in the object of research and in the position from which research is carried out. My main contention is that in spite of all the fuss around the presumed death of cinema and the consequent irrelevance of film studies, film culture is a privileged location for forging connections and shaping values. As it will become clear in a moment, I'm referring to film culture, and not just to film, as a way of gesturing to cinema as a social fact, organizing, or better mediating, cultural encounters. In this respect, the question of intercultural dialogue in and through cinema, to me, is not about what characteristics a film must have in order to enable or ease, but also to direct or police that dialogue. Next slide, please. That's a question that filmmakers, not film scholars, should ask themselves if they think that films are actually able to do such things. As a film scholar, instead, I keep at the center of my work the question of the stakes of mediating culture across boundaries of difference, which we may take as the prerequisite of intercultural dialogue. So I will get there as well, but now I need to take a step back and lay the ground for by starting from how film studies is dealing with migration. Migrant and diasporic cinema has been a staple of European filmmaking since 1980s, notably in Britain, France, and Germany, with the emergence of the so-called Black and Asian British cinema, Ballet cinema, and Turkish German cinema. Filmmaking practices spearheaded by second-generation directors, screenwriters, and actors, taking upon themselves the burden of both representing and putting forward the political agendas of their marginalized communities. In the following decade, in the 90s, as the Cold War order collapsed and ethnic religious tensions exploded over Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East, the continent experienced an intensification of migratory movements whose visibility had been exploited for making migration, even more than labor or integration, a core political issue. These developments coincided with European integration and enlargement, contributing to change the face of most European urban centers and labor market segments. Next slide, please. Both cinema and film studies registered these transformations by shifting attention from the oppositional stances of militant cinema, exemplified on the left by the Black Audio Film Collective, to the celebration of multiculturalism, hybridity, and diversity, exemplified by commercial hits such as Bandit Like Beckham on the right, or other movies like Fatih Akin's Head Home, La Sposa Turca in Italian. A substantial body of scholarship began examining these films as part and parcel of new configurations of global cinema, with academics racing to propose more or less fortunate labels such as intercultural cinema, accented cinema, hybrid cinema, independent transnational cinema, hyphenated identity cinema, cinema of displacement, cinema du métissage, Kino der doppelten Kulturen. In spite of the embrace of diversity and multiculturalism, the scholarly conversation on these films has proceeded with much uniformity. Within a few years, hegemonic approach to film and migration in Europe took shape, and since then it's hardly evolved. It focuses almost exclusively, with an indeed commendable dedication, on what Daniela Berghan and Claudia Steinberg identify as the assumption that cinema is a prime site not just for the negotiation of migrant and diasporic identities, but also for the self-articulation of the collective histories of Europe's respective communities. End quote. Looking at migrant and diasporic cinema from the standpoint of identities and communities seemed to me a fair and yet deceptive assessment of what this mainstream strand of scholarship has been doing. Yes, those issues have been investigated for more than 3 decades, positioning cinema at the crossroad of memory, belonging, and citizenship, but still this has been done only in relation to the textual dimension of film, which is something Ruggero already alluded in the introduction to this webinar. In other words, migrant and diasporic cinema is defined as all films either made by first and further generation filmmakers or dealing explicitly with issues concerning migratory and diasporic existence. In the wake of the transnational turn in film studies, this body of scholarship provided a much-needed contribution for calling into question analytical categories rendered obsolete by the transformations in cultural production and gender by neoliberal globalization, such as, for instance, national cinema, the divide between high and low culture, or between art and commerce, while also challenging the image of Europe and European cinema as ethnically homogeneous. Yet, this analysis, however symptomatic and critical they may be, raise methodological concerns that often go unaddressed, as they postulate a more or less consistent group of films to be representative of a social formation, or to speak on behalf of all community, without actually engaging with the extra-textual aspects that would justify those claims in the first place. This is only marginally a matter of semiotics, and more crucially, a fault of interpreting films as transparent renditions of the social, and not as material forms of cultural expression, or even simply commodities, produced and circulating under specific circumstances that need to be accounted for in their analysis. Issues of funding, labor, community involvement, marketing, circulation, and reception, to mention the most fundamental ones, constitute blind spot for a type of research so much uncritically invested in matters of representation. While I'm not arguing that this form of political and intellectual critique is far from needed, let alone sterile or purely performative, I would like to draw attention to the fact that examining films as autonomous texts doesn't do justice to the multiple ways in which they have an impact within and upon the public sphere. Next slide, please. Let's consider for a moment what's become a textbook example, Gianfranco Rossi's 2016 documentary, Fuoco a Mare, it's in its international version. As assumed you all know, this is a film about life in the island of Lampedusa, framed by contrasting the everyday of the islanders to the extreme experiences migrants go through as they cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. Since its theatrical release, and more noticeable, the Golden Bear Award at the Berlinale Film Festival, Fuoco a Mare has attracted a few controversies. For some, the film showcases a different Europe of solidarity, and in doing so allows for the emergence of new subject positions. For others, it's an exercise of white innocence, conducted by objectifying migrant bodies as simply receivers of Western benevolence and turning migrant death into an object of spectacle. What makes this contraposition exemplary to me is that while scholars and critics were dissecting the film to establish the meaning of Rossi's critical distance, the film took on a life on its own, much more significant for the study of cinema migration than the interpretation of its textual components. Next slide, please. This picture you see had been posted on social media in March 2016, documenting the use of Fuoco a Mare, and it's been posted by former Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. It's taken on the day of the meeting of the European Council that ratified the deal with which the European Union outsourced its migration management to Turkey, recently reconfirmed in the occasion of the Sofa Gate. In the accompanying message, that actually you can barely read, but addressed, you can see this, to Cara Angela and Caro François, Renzi explains the rationale for this gift to his fellow presidents and prime ministers being the necessity to get an authentic insight into the on-the-ground realities of migration in the southernmost outpost of Europe. In the message, he praises Italian citizens for what he calls, in his signature rhetoric, their belief, and I'm quoting Renzi, in the magic of welcoming, end quote, which to me is testament not only to the hypocrisy of the Italian government, but also to the belief in another kind of magic, that of cinema. And this is a very concrete example in which we can see that films work outside of the text itself. And in this case, this film works as a tool of cultural diplomacy, to the extent that we may even say that for one day, 5 years ago, Fuoco a Mare was the official position of the Italian government at the European Council. More seriously, though, this is all the more central in relation to migration issue, and this is something Angelique already hinted at, when we consider how, in the last 3 decades, migration issues have emerged, have been communicated, and more importantly, have been managed at all levels, from policy to information, through a grammar of mediated affect and public feelings, compassion, fear, care, anger, despair, longing, empathy, and so on. To me, it's here, at the intersection of the social and the affective, that cinema matters, differentiating itself from other media through its specific capacity of distributing affect across its audience. Moreover, it's from this perspective, between the social and the affective, that the film text appears to be as one discrete component of a larger cultural assemblage. It may be studied in isolation, of course, but it seems productive examining it along the other components that ultimately contribute to determine what cinema does, to whom, and how. So with this intervention, I'm proposing a shift from film text to film culture in order to improve our understanding of migration. A shift that is from one or more objects bound together in reason of their thematic or production communalities, for instance, identities and communities, to the system within which their existence takes place. Next slide, please. This brings me to the other side of the dual problem, the position from which research is carried out. And this may seem a technical issue of methodology, but I actually argue that this is exactly the political moment of knowledge creation. Because when we start taking cinema seriously as a social fact, we are putting ourselves as film scholars within the film culture we set off to study, in as much as the production of discourse is itself a component of that larger cultural assemblage. And so when I speak about position, I mean position here in two senses. First, in its spatial sense, as the location in which we conduct research. And second, in its critical sense, as the reflexive stance from which we become aware of the networks of relations that unfold before our eyes. So it's not a provocation from my part to say that by not acknowledging this articulation of space and subjectivity within a matrix of power, we end up reproducing the very same dynamics that our work allegedly criticizes. To put it bluntly, I don't believe that in this day and age, we can still pretend that our research has no agenda other than the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of it. By the same token, whether you consider migration as a political issue in itself, or as an issue that has become politicized, for better or worse, it's hard to deny that doing research on the topic cannot be neutral, or that it doesn't make any difference if one speaks from a position of precarity and identifies oneself as a migrant, as an ally, as an activist, or just as a concerned citizen. The practice of situated knowledge opens up new avenues for researching cinema in the context of migrant and diasporic formation. To be grounded within one culture, one must face the need to recognize this one culture as multiple, stratified, and contradictory, innervated by tensions and conflicts. As much as to move across cultures, one is to appreciate how ideas and practices take different shapes along the journey. The same applies to film culture, but how? In the remainder of this talk, I want to touch briefly on the Southern perspective I mentioned in my title. So what I'm going to discuss is meant to give some substance to what I claimed earlier, rather than to showcase research outcomes, given that this is a project in its very early stage. So the question I'm trying to answer with this research is how migration issues enter into the circuit of film culture, not in abstract, of course, but as a core question through which a specific film culture resituates itself within a global, that is globalized, cinema network. In this sense, as I said before, it's never strictly about films migration, even though, of course, they are a crucial component, but on how the topic of migration becomes integral to the imaginary of a film culture, and by extension, to the production of culture. My research takes place in Sicily, a region whose cultural identities are substantially affected by the contemporary shift in migratory policies, discourses, and practices that posits the island at the extreme periphery of Europe. I'm interested in particular in how a majoritarian strength of cultural producers, including institutional actors and agencies, has come to embrace migration and border struggles as forms of social conflict that, to borrow Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nilsson's words, contest the pattern of the world. By charting how regional cultural production becomes a site of resistance, my work intends to foreground those practices and discourses that, by rejecting the idea of migration as a crisis to be managed top-down, as well the resulting political consequences of thinking of migration as a crisis, turned Sicily from the southernmost border of Europe into a center of the Mediterranean. It is in this sense that I explore cultural production as a way of imagining and reimagining historical and affective translocal affinities, adults with, if not in open opposition to, the imperatives coming from the European metropole. Next slide, please. In abstract, I'm fascinated by the political potential disclosed by the conflation of these two images. On the right, the Porta d'Europa in Lampedusa wrapped in garbage bags, and on the left, a fantastic boardwalk connecting Sicily and Tunisia. This is not to suggest a downright refusal of what the idea of Europe may stand for, nor to reiterate the populist distinction between the Europe of people and the Europe of nations. On the contrary, this is an acknowledgement of the messy imbrications that make up this local culture, Sicilian local culture, as a space of competing politics and poetics, so often eclipsed by the narrative of the periphery of Europe, a narrative of social backwardness, economic depression, and cultural fixity. Next slide. From this perspective, migration emerges as a terrain upon which different understandings of citizenships and belonging are articulated by different actors. From the grassroots appropriation of multiple identities and popular traditions as constitutive of the local culture, to the institutional embrace of mobility as an inalienable human right promoted by the 2015 Charter of Palermo that advocates the abolition of the residency permit, permesso di soggiorno, and the underpinning distinction between economic migrants and asylum seekers. While we tend to think of migration activism in humanitarian and cosmopolitan terms, including demands for universal citizenship, the fantasy of a borderless world, and the appeal to a shared human condition. What I'm trying to do with this research is to identify the ways in which this works out also, but not exclusively, through very situated worldviews. So what makes film culture in this context a compelling site of exploration is that unlike more extemporary spaces, more temporary spaces, like the walls of a collapsing building or the pages of a largely utopian document, film culture exists as an aggregation of networks and infrastructures that produce value, often, but not exclusively, in economic terms. And what I'm trying to gain is an organic view on phenomena that exist across scales and between domains, including more mainstream ones. Next slide. And this has been rendered possible by three major transformations in cultural production that have occurred in the last 2 or 3 decades. First, and this is something Angelique illustrated very well, the entry of the European Union as a major financer of cultural production at the local level, through a variety of funds distributed across social projects invested in fostering integration and dialogue. The first film you see on, and the first poster you see on the left, Tumaranke, which is a Bambar Award for travelers who leave their country in search of a better future, is a participative documentary, which has been made by over 30 unaccompanied minor migrants based in Syracuse, Sicily, and using their smartphones. But it's also the main outcome of a year-long video literacy training entirely funded by the Creative Europe and the Refugee Integration Funds. Second, the ripple effects of the devolution of Italian cinema, the process through which regional governments have become major actors in film and television production through the establishment of film-friendly measures such as funds, incentives, and tax revenues, and film commissions meant to attract national and international productions. While the national scope of this phenomenon is well studied, less attention has been paid to the economy of scale upheld by these regional film commissions, which invest a great share of their funds for small-scale projects, mostly documentaries, intended to promote local related content and at the same time retain a very precarious workforce that otherwise would emigrate. Third, the true and seldom acknowledged driver of private investment in the Sicilian cultural sector, tourism, and in particular, the reconfiguration of the tourist offer in order to cater also to segments endowed with high cultural capital through events and festivals that reflect the tastes of a cosmopolitan audience. I find significant how this triangulation of European, regional, and private capital in the Sicilian context, in the face of obviously contrasting agendas, coalesces around the issue of migration and frames it from site to site in relation to wildly different attachments and allegiances, including those engendered by actors who piggyback on these infrastructures to bring forward oppositional discourses and subversive practices, hacking or at least repurposing the institutional matrix of integration. Next slide. The one side that I explore in my research that embodies this shift in a very interesting way is the already mentioned island of Lampedusa, a microcosm where locals, tourists, and migrants used to coexist in relative isolation from each other, with diverse arrangements set in place in order to sanitize the tourist experience from the spectral presence of the detention center and the traffic around it. In recent years, that's many reason of interest to me, this has turned into a site, the island has turned into a site in which these encounters are actively and yet ambiguously promoted, giving way to forms of tourist and cultural consumption grounded on the recuperation of the island's identity as a migrant destination. The pilgrimage to Lampedusa, as you may know, is also an obliged chapter in nearly every study of media and migration in Southern Europe, and thinking to the work of Zucconi, Mazzara, Hom, Broglio, Dasso, Hintiens, all of them having the Lampedusa chapter, further reinforcing the inclusion of academic scholarship within the circuits of knowledge, tourism, of media production I'm interested in exploring. Please, the other slide. In addition, I attend to the myriad of small or very small film festivals taking places throughout the island that deal already from their names with issues of human rights, integration, intercultural dialogue, migration, borders, and bridges, as a way of rebuilding a Mediterranean imagination that contrasts both national and European configuration of space, identity, and belonging. Following Claudio Fogo's reconstruction of Italy's engagement with and participation to Mediterranean culture, I conceive of these festivals as self-professed articulation of the Emporium, the network of trading posts set up by the Greeks along the Mediterranean coasts, in opposition to the practices of the Imperium, embodied by, depending on who speaks, either the European border regimes and migration control, or by right-wing xenophobia and racism. Last slide. Finally, I look at these different sites, the festival, the film set, the street, the workshop, the school, the social center, and how they enter into the circuits of film culture, not only through the circulation of migration-related films, but also through the poorly paid and recognized labor of film personnel, a community of mostly young filmmakers, not always identifying themselves as activists, and in some cases, first or second generation folks, that come together as the lower rank of a regional production culture, shedding light on the kind of class and generational dynamics that are set in motion at the moment when migration and film culture are taken over by the local progressive elites. To conclude, I want to emphasize that what I presented in the last part of my talk is just an illustration of the kind of formations that we can see or expect to see when we leave the text and immerse ourselves in a film culture. Whether we want to talk of intercultural dialogue, integration, incorporation, or differential inclusion, cinema is a location that is worth attending. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. I think you perfectly highlighted the civil, but also the social and I would say, firstly, political value of cinema in the present context. I especially appreciated your reference to cinema politics as new forms of cultural and public diplomacy, which is a very hot topic, I think, in this sense. So thank you so much. I would like to immediately give the word to many of our audience members. Well, first, to Medi Younes, I can answer that not the presentations, but the recording of this webinar will be available in our website www.migration-migrations.com since tomorrow, so you can download it from here. I ask all the attendants to ask their questions or to make their comments. And first we have a question from Maria Pini to Angelique PETRITS. Maria Pini asks, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting, the theme of what we know about what works. What are the methods that better works to assess these initiatives? So what are the methods you think are better working in order to give an evaluation of the different kind of cultural initiatives? Thank you, Angelique, for your answer in advance.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the questions that one of the questions that have been asked to the project, and they need to answer, of course, because we know from examples that as I mentioned, that all the cultural activities are planned by authorities where migrants are not represented, and we don't know, we don't have enough research what we should do in order to include them better. So we have, our intuition, and we have evidence from past events, what works, what doesn't, but we need a more scientific evidence in order to draft policies, to build actions on that. And so this is the one of the questions. I don't have a direct answer because we need, we need this report this research to be done. But I think it's important. It's important to look into that and to have an answer, because we can't implement actions and policies based on intuition and what we feel would work, because it will never work in the end if we want really to have an impact.
Absolutely. Well, even also in our research, we realized how difficult it is to assess from multiple point of view the social, and I would say the ethical impact of cultural and artistic initiatives in this. So I perfectly agree, and I thank you. Alice Cati, who is one of our main researchers, ask Angelique a question concerning the role of media professionals and media scholars in the design and implementation of integration policies. And she adds, it is absolutely clear to me the importance of the involvement of migrants subjects and migrant organization, both in decision-making processes and in setting up policies for inclusion and intercultural dialogue. But are any media professionals or scholars included in the EU expert group that operates in action plan on integration and inclusion? This is the question, Angelique.
No, there's no way. I mean, not at DG Home. I don't know if on commission level for other reasons there are, because there are hundreds of expert groups. If there is a media, it's possible, but I have to look it up. Not in DG Home. Of course, media are important, and we have many contacts with media, and media are included in projects. I mean, for instance, New Neighbors, they are made with media. The CHAC project in Milan is media part of that. So, and also in calls we have of the Asylum Migration Integration Fund for projects. Sometimes, I mean, we had a topic about media representation of migrants. So so it's not an expert group as far as I know. I mean, not in our DG Home context, but I think media are extremely important, and they participate as partners in many of the projects.
Thank you. I have a question for Giuseppe, and but we have another question following to Angelique. To Giuseppe, well, you know about Rosi's work. Rosi has been accused of calligraphy, of a kind of aestheticization of the phenomena linked to migrations or wars or so on. What do you think about the risk of aestheticization of this kind of represented social phenomena by movies?
Yeah, well, I think there's a distinction to be made between the different moments we're talking about. So when we're talking about these kind of allegations in relation to Rossi, we are talking about the Mediterranean crossing, and we are talking in particular about the what Nicolas de Genovas called border spectacle, and that is those moments in which the border emerges in its materiality as a space of violence. And border spectacle are those instances essentially created by the media of spectacularization of migrant death, migrant as victims, powerless individuals in these overcrowded boats on the verge of a shipwreck. And in this sense, this is still I think the dominant image that every one of us has in their mind when they think about migration as crossing. And this is, of course, a consequence of the bad conscience of media culture, Italian media culture, but European media culture in general, of thinking of migration as this rhetoric of victimhood and death. Whereas this emphasizes the very existence, on the contrary, or border regimes that causes death, which is a political discourse that goes in the opposite direction. It's not about migrants as victims, but it's about migrants as people who are forced to do the Mediterranean crossing because of the policies that are set in place by the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question for Angelique from Francesca Pireda. Francesca says, I was reflecting on the use of the word integration. Integration is a term, you know, very controversial because it assumes a process of assimilation of one part to another and does not seem to take into account the fact that many communities have been in Europe for decades. We talk today about the second, third, even fourth generations and transnational communities. Thus, I would like to know your opinion on this term, and if you believe that the language adopted by policies does not risk precluding the changes they would like to make or to promote. What do you think about the term integration and its ambiguity?
Well, our terms are what you make of them. And
as a linguist, I would say.
Yes. And
recover your previous competence.
Yeah. No, I'm very much at home with this discussion. It's in which context you use it and how you use it. You know, words can be manipulated as well. Well, it is the mainstream word we use, but integration is a two-way process. And so yes, I mean, we change when we integrate. I mean, there is a part of assimilation, but we change when we integrate. We change because we receive another culture and we process it and we possess it in a way. So we get transformed by that. So, but also the receiving society gets transformed. so it's a two-way. I mean, and I don't think it's negative to change. I mean, change is not negative as such. When you're forced to change in a direction you don't want to, maybe can be negative, but not change as such. So if we change by welcoming another culture and by making ours in our way, because we will never be, it will never be the same as it is in the destination country. I mean, felt the same as it from a person born in that country. So I don't think this is a negative thing, and also. Again, the welcoming society, they also assimilate, in quotation marks, a part of the culture of the immigrant, and so this can make us richer. It doesn't mean that we forget our own culture in which we were born, and it can be very complementary. And it makes us more open, and so more open to the others, you know. So I never saw it as negative, personally. But of course, it depends. Yes, it can be used in contexts where it can sound negative. Yes, I agree with that.
Well, we can say that integration doesn't seem. Doesn't implies automatically disintegration. Integration is not. So I think we don't have any other question, but so we are perfectly in time. I take just the final minutes to thanks the organizing committee. To thanks particularly Alice Cati, Martina Guerinoni, Laura Peia, Maria Francesca Piredda, Anna Sfardini, and Matteo Tarantino, who helped in organizing this webinar and the series of webinar. And I remind you the next appointment, the 26th of April, at the same time, we'll talk about theater and performing arts with Pierluigi Musarò, a scholar from Università degli Studi di Bologna and the PI of Atlas of Transitions. And as discussant, we'll have Guglielmo Schininà, who works at International Organization for Migration of United Nations. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our audience, and I hope this webinar has been very interesting for me, and I hope that it has been the same for you. So thank you, and good night to everybody. Bye bye. See you on the 26th of April. Thank you so much.